All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to It's Up to Us, LGBTQ plus youth empowerment as sexual violence prevention. This is part of a series of live and recorded content on Fridays in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So Angie, who I'll let introduce themselves in just a moment, they and I started planning a version of this presentation back in the summer of 2021. I think we submitted a proposal to an adolescent health conference and we presented there in February of this year. And so the information we're going to share with you is, it's really well established within the sexual violence prevention field, but I think it's become even more imperative to talk about since even February. There is the need to share this openly, I think, in our communities because of the conversations that have been happening, in the media, around legislation, and just in public dialogue, framing LGBTQ plus identities as dangerous to youth and families. And this is in direct conflict with what we do as anti-violence advocacy. And we need to be especially clear about that now in order to help LGBTQ plus youth not only survive, but thrive. So we are very happy to have you joining us, whether in the live webinar or if you're watching the recording later on. All right, with that, some introductions. So my name is Amanda Schumacher. My pronouns are they and she, and I am the Sexual Assault Program Director at Family Support Center, which is an agency serving individuals, families, and communities impacted by domestic and intimate partner violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and child and elder abuse and neglect here in Eau Claire and Chippewa counties of West Central Wisconsin. And joining me today is my colleague from Wakasa, Angie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda, for inviting me back for this super cool presentation that we did in February. So my name is Angie Rehling. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a prevention coordinator with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And what the coalitions are tasked to do is provide support, training, just basic technical assistance to those who are directly responding to survivors every day in the field. And we also provide direct assistance to the advocates and the prevention educators within that agency. And we also provide support to survivors themselves. So we're just going to talk about a base understanding of sexual violence. So we have just a general understanding of what it is and how complex the issue is. So Wakasa has defined sexual violence as any act or behavior which can be verbal or physical that is sexual in nature and then is conducted through force, threats, coercion, manipulation, or abuse of power. Sexual assault is a pervasive form of sexual violence that impacts thousands of individuals in Wisconsin every year and millions more in the nation and throughout the world. Sexual violence is a tool of oppression, often used to intimidate, target, and exploit historically marginalized communities and populations. However, sexual violence does affect people of all identities, ages, and abilities. So Wakasa likes to use the term sexual violence as an umbrella term to encompass a lot of different things. So as you can see in this visual, sexual violence is very broad. Though historically, our society has had a very narrow view as to what sexual violence actually looks like. So usually people tend to think of rape or child sexual abuse when they think of sexual assault. However, this is very damaging as it means survivors may not know what happened to them was sexual violence. And then it also creates barriers to them receiving support and services. So sexual violence is a community-wide problem that requires all of us, every single one of us, to do our part to prevent it. Perpetrators of sexual violence come from all walks of life and identities. They can be acquaintances, family members, intimate partners, trusted individuals, or strangers. So despite popular perception, perpetrators of sexual violence are not motivated by uncontrollable sexual desire. So assaults can be motivated by anger, a desire to feel powerful by dominating, controlling, or humiliating a victim, and or a sense of entitlement to sex. So perpetrators are fully responsible for their choices and their actions, and it is never ever the fault of the victim or a survivor. Sexual violence can have a profound effect on a person's well-being, impacting the survivor's life in many different ways, and the effects can be long-lasting. Sexual violence is a preventable, and healing from it is possible, though the healing process is different for everyone. Experiences with institutionalized racism may make it difficult for victims and survivors of color to trust the systems and institutions that are supposed to help them. So to add to the complexity of sexual violence, our society has different definitions. There are legal or statutory definitions, medical definitions, and culturally specific definitions. So as I mentioned, this adds to people not understanding what happened to them actually was sexual violence, which then can delay them in getting the support they need to heal, and also delay reporting if they choose to do so. For example, historical definitions led to men possibly thinking that what happened to them wasn't sexual violence because they can't be victims, or societal belief that women can't be perpetrators, and or that it is only rape if it involved forced penis and vagina contact. It also prevents those who are perpetrating sexual violence possibly not to know that they are actually, in fact, perpetrating sexual violence. According to research published in Violence in Gender in 2014, many male college students report that they have never committed rape, but they were actually unaware that the sexually aggressive actions that they've engaged in actually does, in fact, constitute rape.
Thank you, Angie, for that overview. I just feel like it's so important that we have that common vocabulary to start from so that we know what we're talking about moving forward while we really drill down into the issue of LGBTQ plus youth empowerment as sexual violence prevention. So we're going to spend some time looking at general risk factors for sexual violence and then how these risk factors play out in the experiences specifically of LGBTQ plus youth. So as a reminder, when we talk about risk factors for sexual violence, we do not mean ways that people are putting themselves at risk, right? Instead, we are situating our discussion of both risk and protective factors in the territory of social determinants of health. This framework understands health outcomes, both positive and negative, to be heavily influenced by the social environments in which people live their lives. And of course, people don't do that in isolation. So in essence, we're talking about the social environments as the physical, but also the kind of idealistic settings where people exist in relation to other people. So our focus is going to be on relationships and belonging, whether those relationships are interpersonal relationships or relationships within to a community, or even how a person kind of understands themselves as relating to society in general. All right, the first risk factor we want to take a look at is lack of comprehensive healthy sexuality education. In general terms, this is considered a risk factor because it leaves young people without the necessary information to navigate things like boundaries, desires, and other sexual health decisions. So fear, shame, and uncertainty, but even just simple lack of understanding can increase the likelihood of being harmed by coercive behaviors. For LGBTQ plus youth, this is amplified by the fact that formal curricula might not even acknowledge them. My own ninth grader gets to be an example for a lot of the work I do, but he had a human growth and development unit in his health class last semester. And so I was nosy and I took a screenshot of one of the quiz questions. And so in this question, it's about what couples should discuss following or before they choose to be sexually active. And the correct response to get full credit is all of the answers. So that's option D. But there are also options that refer to pregnancy, contraceptives to prevent pregnancy that aren't necessarily relevant to all couples. And, that is only one pretty minor example, but those small exclusions can absolutely compound. And because of this lack of formal curricula, many LGBTQ plus youth understandably turn to informal sources of information, so like friends and the internet. And this can be a double-edged sword because these resources truly are often affirming, but on the other hand, there is a lack of quality control. For example, there's definitely well-vetted factual websites that have sound and supportive information about LGBTQ plus healthy sexuality. And then there's Reddit. And then there are sites that might purport to offer factual information. They might even look really polished and professional, but they're actually containing misleading content, because maybe it's from a source that is anti-LGBTQ plus and is intentionally painting a stigmatizing picture of LGBTQ sexuality. So many LGBTQ plus youth don't have or don't feel like they can ask for guidance in figuring out what information is valid, and it ends up being a roll of the dice, which can have really serious consequences. Further, many LGBTQ plus youth are unable to openly explore developmentally appropriate relationships due to just the lack of safe opportunities to do so. And this can lead to relationships that are carried out in secret. And in those cases, unchecked harm is more likely to occur. Or another potential is that LGBTQ folks can put off having these relationships until adulthood when they, are granted more autonomy. And so they've missed out on that gradual ramping up of navigating desire and intimacy and healthy decision making that was happening with many of their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And so instead, they're just suddenly in the adult world of dating and sex, like right in the deep end. And that also sets up the stage for vulnerability to harm. The second risk factor is lack of positive or trusted adult role models. So we all learn about relationships and what makes them healthy or unhealthy from different sources, but one of the main ways that we glean this information about the world around us is through adult role models. Without these meaningful real life examples, young people may struggle to cultivate healthy relationships, identify what healthy relationships look like, and also importantly, be unable to identify and interpret harmful behaviors or experiences. And that can also lead to situations where early intervention in those emerging experiences of sexual violence, where there may be some red flag behaviors present, isn't possible because those solid relationships with supportive adults don't exist. What does this look like for LGBTQ plus youth then? Many LGBTQ plus youth have been deliberately deprived of access to even knowing LGBTQ plus adults on any level. There are ideologies that we're probably all familiar with that portray LGBTQ plus adults as being universally inappropriate role models. And if being LGBTQ plus is considered by some to be a negative outcome, then the thinking follows like, okay, well, if we don't let them see any trans people being happily trans, then they won't be trans anymore. But that is not the reality. What the reality is the young person will still be LGBTQ plus, just without that workable roadmap of what that looks like in adulthood. Many other LGBTQ plus youth do have supportive adults in their lives, though, but those adults might not necessarily have a lot of comfort or fluency in talking about LGBTQ plus relationships and sexuality. And it's understandable why. I mean, very few current adults, even queer and trans adults, grew up hearing affirming information about LGBTQ plus relationships and sexuality. So there's still a sense of otherness or even danger attached to these discussions that's being inadvertently communicated. And finally, I can't stress this enough. We have to acknowledge that it is challenging and risky for LGBTQ plus youth without those clearly defined adult role models to try to safely assess which adults in their life are going to be supportive and helpful and which might react poorly. This really disincentivizes them from offering any sort of information, from disclosing information about their identity or the relationship or their experiences. I will hand it over to Angie for the next slide.
This spectrum we're going to look at for all youth is just past and co-occurring trauma. Trauma, the cumulative impact of trauma can overwhelm a person's ability to identify or respond to potential sources of harm. Trauma negatively impacts and interrupts almost every aspect of our lives, whether that's mentally, physically, and emotionally. It could impact our work life, our personal life, our sense of ability to just relax and just decompress from whatever we are going through. And all of that trauma can follow us into adulthood. And research shows the more trauma a person experiences, the greater the negative impact. So you can see an increase in risky behaviors, poor mental and physical health. For instance, a Black youth who is homeless can experience multiple stressors from racism and homelessness, and then as well as food insecurity and poor medical care access. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It is a tool often used by professionals to help identify exposure to various forms of childhood trauma. So how this impacts LGBTQ youth is due to the societal shame, the stigma, the oppression, discrimination. LGBTQ youth are more at risk of having more ACEs. So intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1970s, describes how our privileges and discriminations combine to form unique experiences. So while a white LGBTQ plus youth could experience oppression and discrimination based on their sexuality and or gender, again, a Black LGBTQ plus youth may have to deal with racism, then while also dealing with homophobia, transphobia, or biphobia. So another risk factor is looking at those social norms that uplift and perpetuate rape culture. Rape culture is something that we talk a lot about when we are thinking about sexual violence prevention. So our society is made up of these rigidly designed social norms, and then they dictate how we perceive our own or other people's lived experiences. So we are conditioned to accept only one form of masculinity and femininity. We are expected to fit into certain gender roles and expectations. We are expected to play and interact with things that fit into those gender roles. And we are bombarded with these messages in movies, TV, books, etc., of what love is supposed to look like and what it's supposed to feel like, who we can love and how we can love them. We are pressured even before we are born to fit into these ideals. And if we can't, or maybe we just don't want to, our lives can be harder and we are at risk of experiencing different forms of violence from an early age. So one of the root causes of sexual violence in our societies isn't the normalization of violence. It's just a part of our lives, that it is solely the victim's fault and that we must just deal with it instead of preventing it. So normalizing that violence shields us from seeing that our narratives of gender-based violence are a larger societal issue important to challenge. So here we can see how that normalization of violence is threaded throughout our lives in the form of rape culture. So the National Sexual Violence Resource Center says that we need to both understand and address those factors that contribute to violence that exposes some communities, especially those communities who have been historically oppressed or left out, to high rates of sexual violence. So rape culture is a part of that. It is those set of beliefs and normative behaviors that create an environment that allows for, and often in some cases condone, sexual violence. So it puts the onus of prevention onto survivors when the focus should be on changing the harmful beliefs, behaviors, and norms within our culture. So therefore everyone has a role in interrupting and stopping rape culture, and we must all work together to address those deep-rooted systems of oppression that contribute to the inequities in overall well-being, safety, and health. When we look at these rape culture pyramids, it's important to note that it's not ranking those systems of harm or those types of harm. It shows how they build on one another. They often work together, how they're woven into and existing within our relationships, cultural beliefs, and larger societal structures. So the normalization of sexual violence in subtle and overt ways allows violence to continue unquestioned. So when we look at the root causes of violence, the base of that pyramid, racism and other forms of oppression are at the core. So rape culture is linked to those cultural and societal social norms of how people are supposed to act, dress, express themselves, who they love, who they like, the color of their skin, whether or not they're disabled, and so on. It is about the perception of power and who people think they can exert their perceived power over. So when we look in our society, we can see that sexual violence is often not taken seriously. It is seen as the victim's fault. For example, they shouldn't have been wearing that. Who were they hanging out with? They shouldn't have put themselves in that position, or maybe they shouldn't have been drinking alcohol in the first place. So LGBTQ people have to deal with that, as well as the biases and stereotypes that they are promiscuous, that they cannot be monogamous, or that they can be turned straight or heterosexual by having sex with men. So therefore, it isn't taken as seriously. Well, if they just wouldn't be gay, then that wouldn't have happened.
Thanks, Angie. So now, after painting a pretty bleak picture of some of the risk factors, we're all going to take a collective breath and talk about protective factors, those that reduce the likelihood that someone will experience sexual violence. Because really, I mean, what brings us here today is the belief that it's up to us to actively implement the protective measures instead of just kind of hoping that they'll be organically present. Just like that current dynamic of rape culture that Angie talked about, that has been intentionally constructed. And so this has to be intentionally dismantled. And it probably goes without saying, but a lot of these protective factors are basically just the opposite of the risk factors. Still, I think it is relevant to take a look at them more closely and sort of examine how they work, how these protective factors work in practice. And like risk factors, I think protective factors, unless we explicitly call them out, tend to be invisible when we don't interrogate the whys and the hows behind them. So supportive and inclusive educational and community environments is a protective factor because that connectivity within one's environment has really been linked to positive health outcomes. I think there's a tendency to dismiss the idea of belonging as just kind of a nice thing, rather than an integral part of our well-being with significant health benefits. But the World Health Organization has this work group called the Social Exclusion Knowledge Network. And the sole focus of it is, looking at belonging versus exclusion and the health ramifications of these, whether we're talking about, interpersonal relationships or at the political, cultural, or economic level. So studies of these phenomena have shown that the distance between connection and exclusion is where those health disparities emerge. And those include disparities involving that likelihood to experience sexual violence. So when we think about environments that emphasize the importance of care, of dignity, and respect for every individual, we find that sexual violence is not tolerated in those spaces. The focus is instead shifted to preventing harm, eliminating harm, protecting people. And we can visualize that in this counterpart to the rape culture pyramid that Angie shared earlier. So this imagines a world that centers the values of justice, liberation, decolonization, really all of which hinge on flattening power imbalances and bringing everyone into community. So how do we support this sense of community, belonging, connectivity, right, for LGBTQ plus youth in particular? Schools, I would say, have become a flashpoint of many conversations around what is appropriate for young people to learn about gender and sexual orientation. But from a sexual violence prevention standpoint, we can say that LGBTQ plus inclusive curricula, not only in terms of healthy sexuality education, but across subjects in all classrooms, this is absolutely critical to fostering belonging. And I should add that this not only has a positive impact on LGBTQ students, but on all students. There's no reason that the history and culture of any fellow classmates should be considered taboo if our goal is robustly inclusive environments. To that end, too, there are some environmental and kind of practical changes we can adopt to promote inclusion. Some examples of those are like signs and symbols. So it really depends on the setting, what might work in a given environment, but pride flags, safe spaces stickers, pronoun buttons on staff, books and other materials featuring LGBTQ plus topics in libraries and classrooms, images in spaces that feature LGBTQ plus people. My brother and his partner are both educators in New York City public schools, and their Department of Education recently collaborated with a historian named Hugh Ryan on a series of these hidden voices posters that highlight underrepresented LGBTQ figures from history. And they made the high-res versions downloadable, not just for New York City teachers, but for anyone. So all of these things signal that acknowledgement of consideration for LGBTQ plus people in the physical environment. Another suggestion is auditing language that's used on forms and documents just to maximize inclusion. And that might involve any of a number of things, like giving people the opportunity to self-identify gender and pronouns by filling in a blank field instead of requiring them to choose from a drop down or like other limited potential options. Another possibility would be like asking for information on the adult in the household rather than mother or father. And I mean, that one actually eliminates access barriers for a lot of different families. Ensuring accessibilities of facilities, so like bathrooms, locker rooms, and also programs such as sports and clubs and activities, ones that are meant to equitably serve the needs of everyone in that communal space so that LGBTQ plus people also enjoy that accessibility. And finally, revising or adopting policy to be less limiting, just approaching policy with a wide angle lens. That can feel counterintuitive, I think, when we're used to thinking of violence prevention strategies as only being protective if they're like strictly limiting. So metaphorically speaking, more locked doors, fewer windows to ward off danger. And that, again, is a metaphor. I don't want anyone claiming like, oh, Amanda said, don't lock your doors. But oftentimes, it's just bringing people in from the margins, right? And decreasing isolation. Policies encouraging collective responsibility for each other. That promotes safety very effectively. The next protective factor is a reversal of the risk factor that I talked about in the last section. So it's engaged and supportive adults in a young person's life. And that includes ideally parents and adult family members. But as the saying goes, the presence of even one trusted adult who shows interest, who treats them with respect and cares about what happens to them, regardless of who that adult is in relation to the young person, that has been shown to reduce harm and enhance protection for all youth. So why is that the case? It really helps youth envision a future for themselves and set their standards and goals for healthy relationships and behaviors. And the more examples of ways this can look, the better. Also, caring adults are crucial parts of intervention for potentially harmful or violent situations in those early stages before they escalate. So the relationship with the protective adult is already well established. It's based in trust, and that adult has the potential to say, look, I've noticed this happening lately, and there's some things I'm wondering about. So can we talk through it together? And the young person would be more likely to be open to that conversation if the engaged and supportive adult relationship exists in the first place. So there is also this tends to be a source of recent misinformation when it comes to LGBTQ plus youth. LGBTQ youth also, and maybe even especially, benefit from having engaged and supportive adults in their lives. And those don't realistically only have to be LGBTQ plus adults, but it really is extremely helpful for there to be, queer and trans representation among the supportive adults in their lives. Again, so they can envision a future in which being a happy, healthy LGBTQ plus adult is possible. And I like to use the example of, there's a film, I'm a big fan of film, so I always draw from that world, but there's a film that I enjoy, and it's a French movie called The Wild Reeds. And it's set in a small city in France in the 1960s. And one of the characters is a queer teenager who is just really yearning for connection and to find his people. And there's this very minor subplot where the teen knows that the owner of this small town shoe store is a man who has a male partner. And, those two are not very open about their lives. But this is like the one perspective role model this teen has. So there's a scene where the teen just kind of bears his soul to this quiet, unassuming shoe store owner. And he says, like, I need to know that it's going to be okay. What is life like for you? How did you deal with heartbreak when you were my age? And it's just this emotional outpouring. And he wasn't looking for information about the mechanics of this guy's sex life. He just wanted reassurance that some kind of happiness and stability was possible. And of course, in the context of the film, the shoe store guy is like, I don't really know what to do with this. I don't know how to help you. Um, and while this is a fictional portrayal and it's set in the past, that desperation for some future oriented connection to hold on to is still very real. Which is why that one way, so getting back to my point, one way that we can ensure there are caring LGBTQ plus adults involved in the lives of youth is to create a culture where it's safe and accepted and standard for LGBTQ adults to be open about their identities and vocal in their support of LGBTQ plus youth. Also, for all adults who care about kids in our lives, it's important to seek out education about issues affecting LGBTQ plus populations, and to do it independently, not just relying on young people to supply this information to us and, assuming if they don't let us know about it, it must not be important. And finally, if you're prepared to be an adult ally to LGBTQ plus youth, you need to clearly and openly identify yourself that way and let your actions match that stance. So speak out against injustice when you see it, introduce yourself with your pronouns, go to community pride celebrations, just be very clear and unsubtle about it. All right, back to Angie.
So another protective factor is healthy messaging about sexuality and relationships. Healthy sexuality is one of my soapboxes. I love having conversations around sexual violence prevention and healthy sexuality because it is very intrinsically linked. It's a protective factor for all youth because it equips young people to identify and articulate their desires as well as their personal boundaries, make well-informed health decisions, and communicate respectfully with their partners now and in the future. And I think one of the misconceptions about that is, and we're seeing it a lot now in the media, is that we're having these conversations with young people, elementary age youth, about sex. And there are well-documented age-appropriate ways to have these conversations because ultimately when we're thinking about sexual violence prevention, we're not just talking about sex. There are other factors and other conversations that we need to be having when we're talking about sexual violence prevention. And one of those very simple ways is to talk about consent. And that is where, when we're having these conversations, age-appropriate conversations with our littles, we're talking about not forcing them to hug Great Aunt Sue, who they've never met, and only see, for 5 seconds around Thanksgiving or whatever. Respecting our littles' knows and trusting that they know what they want with their bodies and what they want with their lives is an incredibly important base level foundation for having future relationships with other people. So teaching all young people about their normal bodily function, something that our bodies just normally do, should include information about their reproductive organs without shame. So allowing young people to understand their desires and needs allows them to understand what they don't want, what they don't need. And healthy messaging will allow a space for that exploration, as well as a space for hearing and respecting a no from someone. We don't always like to hear no's, but we need to practice on respecting people's boundaries. So how can we implement that for LGBTQ youth? So learning about same-gender relationships, relationships with trans people, and learning about asexual people, just for example, is beneficial for everyone. We aren't assuming anyone's sexuality and or gender. We aren't separating LGBTQ youth and othering them. And we are ensuring knowledge and normalizing LGBTQ plus young people. So when young people don't receive the necessary information about their development, they'll go somewhere else, right? So we as the adults in their lives need to understand all of the possible places they are getting the information so we can help them determine accurate versus inaccurate information. And media literacy is an incredibly important tool in that critical thinking about the information that's out there. We are empowering them to decipher what is healthy and what is not healthy and making their own decisions. Another protective factor is the enhancement of wraparound supports. So when young people are unconditionally supported in all aspects of their life, so their health, their safety and well-being, all of their needs are met, their risk of experiencing trauma is significantly reduced. And importantly, they are better equipped to recognize and avoid harmful situations in the future. So we can do this by ensuring all programming and marketing materials are inclusive of everyone, by showing same gender relationships, removing that binary language, making sure policies specifically mention prohibiting LGBTQ discrimination and prominently display them, and then reinforcing those policies when bullying or discrimination is reported. So backing up those words, backing up their policy with action. So when I think about all of the trainings that I have done over the years, I often get asked to do these trainings only for staff who have contact with students or clients or just other people in the organization. And I understand that. I understand that time is very precious, but this leaves out roles, really critical, important roles as receptionists, custodial workers, and board members. And when we think about the culture of organizations, every single person adds to that culture of the workplace. And when we leave out some staff, it leaves room for discrimination to happen anywhere else. It also sends a message that some staff or roles are more important than others. So thinking about training every single person within that agency, because all of us individually have an important role in the culture of our spaces that we're in. So we cannot talk about homophobia, transphobia, biphobia without also discussing racism, ableism, and other forms of oppression. Thinking back to the rape culture pyramid, all of those things at the bottom, the foundation of rape culture is racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, all those forms of oppression. We're complex beings. And our lives are shaped by a multitude of experiences, whether they're good or bad. So we need to understand our individual roles in addressing and ending discrimination and oppression.
Thanks, Angie. So transitioning now to our last section for you here today. When we talked earlier about the protective factor of LGBTQ plus young people having supportive and affirming adults in their lives, we believe that one critical strategy that goes to this is being equipped with the ability to confront and dismantle myths and misinformation that is harming LGBTQ plus youth. At the beginning of the presentation, I alluded to the current climate in which different groups, movements, ideologies are labeling LGBTQ plus people as dangerous to children and families. Now, although I say current climate, don't get me wrong, these tactics have really been used on many occasions in the past, albeit with slight differences. Nonetheless, this is a moment in time where we can really see threats to LGBTQ plus safety escalating. And as part of the anti-violence movement, we believe that it is imperative that we're speaking to this, because what we've seen is anti-LGBTQ initiatives capitalizing on people's legitimate fears about sexual violence and using language associated with those fears about sexual violence to bolster their cause. Some words that are increasingly being used in a decontextualized and inaccurate way include grooming, pedophilia, sexualization. I even heard libraries that carry LGBTQ related material referred to as sex traffickers. So, as strange as this may seem, we need to emphasize that these views, these language usages, do not align with anti-violence advocates like Angie and myself, with others who are on this call. And as outrageous as all of this appears, and it is, we know that it's going to continue to pose a danger to LGBTQ plus youth and populations in general if this information isn't interrupted. And I want to talk for a couple minutes about why that is. First, it falsely conflates LGBTQ plus identities with harmful behavior. And this sends a message to LGBTQ plus youth that first, that their identity is shameful, or that it's the undesirable result of sexual coercion, and also that their identity poses an ongoing threat to themselves and others. And to that latter point, there's a writer who I reference a lot. His name is Garrett Conley. He wrote the memoir Boy Erased, and there was a movie version a few years ago too. So he's written and spoken at length about being a survivor of conversion therapy, but also how that experience with conversion therapy intersected with his experience as a survivor of sexual assault. He was assaulted as a first-year college student at a point where he'd never really had any intimate relationship with another man before. And he's described really poignantly the impact of coming from a faith tradition that sent the message that there was no such thing as healthy LGBTQ plus sexuality, and that there was no differentiation between consensual gay sex and rape. And so that by choosing this path, that he had resigned himself to participating in that harm. And we can see pretty clearly how damaging it is to a survivor of violence to receive that message that what happened to you is your fault because you chose this. This messaging is also dangerous because it distorts information about widely accepted protective factors, like the ones we just discussed. In fact, pretty much every single one of the protective factors, the prevention strategies that we have mentioned, has been recently mischaracterized as abusive, which blows my mind. So we need to remember that removing those vital supports expose LGBTQ plus youth to greater risk. And finally, this misinformation, this messaging, these campaigns are dangerous because they create barriers for LGBTQ plus people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and sexual assault or abuse. It keeps them from accessing necessary services because, again, that idea is reinforced. What if I'm to blame for this? Or, what if I go to a sexual assault service provider and they say that I'm the actual harm doer?
So a lot of the things that you will see are based on myth. And we have a lot of conversations around myth versus fact. And addressing interrupting myths is critical in creating a culture that affirms and uplifts LGBTQ youth. Myths, biases, stereotypes are still prevalent today. So addressing and interrupting them is critical to creating a culture that affirms and uplifts LGBTQ youth. How we respond to those myths is incredibly important, as we tend to remember the negative more than the positive. And remember, we all have our own individual parts to play in preventing sexual violence. So when we have these conversations, framing those responses Instead of focusing on those myths, framing responses from an empowerment-based focus will reshape how we approach the conversation, and ultimately how we remember the information. It can also lead to more productive conversations around sexual violence prevention. As Amanda alluded to previously, there are myths flying around that LGBTQ people are predators, and we can all understand how that is incredibly harmful. LGBTQ people are no more likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence than cisgender heterosexual people. Myths that perpetuate this trope reinforce that we only see LGBTQ representation in a harmful manner. LGBTQ youth need to see LGBTQ plus adults thriving and happy. It brings us back to that need for having positive and healthy role models in our lives. And we all have a responsibility in ensuring that happens by celebrating LGBTQ people. Don't just consume the media that shows LGBTQ pain. Make sure that you're including stories of hope, joy, happiness, and success by reading books, watching movies, and listening to podcasts. I think a lot of times in media we'll see specifically movies about the coming out process for LGBTQ people. And while that is incredibly important to see and understand, it's usually framed in a harmful manner, and we need to see that everyone, not just LGBTQ youth, but cisgender heterosexual people need to see the joy, the happiness, the success, so we can see, and going into the other side, Amanda, that being LGBTQ plus is just as developmentally ordinary as being heterosexual and cisgender. So when we see that joy, when we see that happiness, we can see that, oh wow, queer people can be happy. They can be, that they are, not can, they are just as ordinary as everyone else. We need to shift the messaging to the fact that being queer, being trans, being bisexual is literally just a thing that happens to people, right? Like it isn't something special or fantastic. It is, right? Like we are just here, existing on this earth, just like everybody else. So when we normalize our differences in a healthy and affirming way, that will have a positive effect on LGBTQ youth and their mental health. They'll feel more confident, supported, included, seen, and heard. Hiding aspects of who we are is exhausting and painful. And to deal with that, add to that, LGBTQ youth may develop unhealthy coping skills and put themselves in risky situations just to feel included. There is no shame in a same gender attraction, or if you're feeling your gender is not the one that you were assigned at birth. So much of what we talked about today reinforces the need for representation in all things. Think back to a time when you first were able to see someone who looks like you, someone who acted like you, and something that you really are truly passionate about and you enjoy, whether that's like comic books, video games, movies, TV shows, whatever. Remember what it felt like to be seen for the positive aspects of yourself, and that measurable amount of happiness to know that you aren't alone in the world. And making sure all youth get that information is important to help dispel those biases, myths that foster the fear of LGBTQ people. And remember from the previous slide, being LGBTQ, being queer is just, is ordinary. It just is. We talked about this previously, that media literacy is an incredible tool for young people to critically examine the information they receive from the world. Critically examining messages is a great way to interrupt rape culture that is very pervasive in our society. And it is a tool that all youth should have. So as we talked about before, youth need to have those trusted adults to help process any confusing or harmful messaging that they see in all of the media that we are saturated by. So ensuring all people have access to those facilities that they need to take care of themselves is incredibly important. It's an important part of safety for everyone, especially trans folks and gender expansive youth. So barring trans students from facilities that are safe, comfortable, and gender affirming is discriminatory. And that discrimination causes real harm. It places trans students at heightened risk of harassment, assault, and bullying. It impedes their ability to secure an education and participate fully in their life. And it can cause damage to their physical and emotional health. Conversely, there is no evidence that allowing trans students to choose bathrooms or locker room facilities that correspond to their gender puts other students at risk. Segregating access to those spaces is unnecessary and will just reinforce stereotypes that trans people are predators when essentially they are one of the most at-risk communities of sexual violence. So when Amanda and I did this presentation in February, we created a list of resources for folks. Share any of these resources on the slide, as well as things that aren't here. There is an incredible wealth of information out there to help us understand how preventing homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and other forms of oppression is an essential part of sexual violence prevention. And we also wanted to include the statewide LGBTQ agencies to offer support for whatever work that you are doing. It is great when we have questions. However, we want to make sure that those questions are answered in a responsible manner. And these are great agencies who are tasked to do that for the community.
All right, that is all we have for you today. I am going to stop the recording soon to allow the people who are on the call to ask any questions they might have confidentially. But in the meantime, to wrap up, thank you so much for joining us. You'll find my contact information as well as Angie's contact information, and we welcome follow-ups with questions. Again, we appreciate your interest in this topic, and we hope you can carry forward some of what you heard today into the world with you. Thanks again.